I should say at the outset that I was born in Poland in 1945 and spent my formative years there before my family emigrated to Canada in 1959. A greatly reduced family. Before the war, my parents lived in a tiny shtetl in what was then the Polish part of the Ukraine. All their relatives, parents, siblings, cousins, were murdered in Nazi massacres in that violent vicinity, but their own lives were saved by their Ukrainian neighbors who hid them at the risk of losing their own lives. In Nazi-governed Poland, the penalty for helping Jewish people was death. This personal story was my entry point, as it is for so many second-generation descendants of Holocaust survivors, into the broader history of Polish Jews and of Polish-Jewish relations. It turns out to be a richly interesting, centuries-long story of Jewish presence within the Polish polity and of coexistence which often amounted to multiculturalism avant la lettre, long before such ideas arrived in the Western world. In that long and fascinating narrative, the interwar period was exceptional for several reasons. For the first time in its long history, Poland became a nation-state in the modern sense of the word, and this changed the relationship of its substantial minorities among which Jewish people were the largest, to the governing powers. After being in effect a caste with its separate customs, religion, and language, Jews were now citizens with all the demands for loyalty to the state and its basic principles. The degree of that loyalty varied, and so did the nature of the government. In the 1920s, Poland was in effect led by Józef Piłsudski, a relatively liberal politician who was in favor of minority rights and who was seen by the Jews themselves as being especially friendly to them. He was affectionately nicknamed the Jewish grandpa. But after his death in 1935, the leadership of the state moved to a right-wing National Democratic Party, which wanted to keep Poland ethnically and religiously homogeneous. At the same time, the new status of the Jewish minority meant that the 1920s and 30s saw a tremendous flourishing of Jewish politics and culture. One characteristic of the period was an almost baffling proliferation of Jewish parties, representing all stripes of opinion, aspects of Jewish society, and visions for the future. There were several Zionist parties which shared the wish to emigrate to the Promised Land, but whose allegiances varied from a leftward to a more centrist and even right-wing orientation. There was the Socialist Bund Party, whose ideology was to stay in Poland and improve conditions for Jewish working people right there. The large and powerful Aguda Party sponsored religious education for young Jewish people at a time of increasing secularization. All of these parties had representatives in the Polish government, enough of them to form a separate Jewish parliamentary circle, within which debates were often animated and represented a wide spectrum of opinion. And all of them gave rise to youth groups whose members held lively discussions, went to summer camps together, and engaged in physical activities previously rare in religious Jewish communities. It is notable that the youth groups hewed to the notion of equality between men and women and discussed literature ranging from Emma Goldman to Marx and Heinrich Heine. The spirit of solidarity nurtured in the groups became important during the worst of times, when women played an unusually large role in resisting the Nazi occupation, and when belonging to a group was crucial to devising strategies and methods of resistance, as well as providing a sense of belonging. In addition to the turmoil of politics, the range of opinion within the Jewish population was reflected in the baffling number of newspapers published in Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish, no fewer than 130 of them, read avidly for their coverage not only of Jewish issues, but of world affairs. Beyond the turmoil of politics and its various expressions, the vitality and variety of Jewish life was wonderfully evident in the sphere of culture and the arts. The hub of cultural activity was, not surprisingly, Warsaw, the capital city, 1/3 of whose population was Jewish. They included Orthodox Jews engaged in trade and small crafts, some of whom lived in impoverished conditions. But Warsaw, and to a lesser extent other big cities, was also where the newly acculturated, often secular Jews tended to live, and they included writers, poets, filmmakers, cabaret actors, and yet others. There were literary groups for writers who chose Hebrew, Yiddish, or Polish as their language of expression, and which included novelists and poets whose names became famous throughout Poland and sometimes in the wider world as well, Bruno Schulz and Isaac Singer among them. It was a rather astounding fact that 5 of the most famous Polish poets in that period were Jewish. Including Alexander Watt, a modernist poet who had my favorite answer to whether he was Polish or Jewish. "I am Polish, and Jewish, he said, a formulation which expresses a deeply internalized bicultural identity. There was Jan Brzechwa, author of charming children's poems, and the most famous of them all, Julian Tuwim, whose poems we memorized when I was growing up. Before the war, Tuwim was not only known for his poetry, but as the founder of several cabarets where Polish and Jewish audiences congregated with equal pleasure, a very Polish form of entertainment which survived World War II and functioned underground in post-war Poland. And there were also cafes where writers were known to congregate and sometimes to read their work to each other before it was published. The recently rediscovered poet known as Ginchanka met with a terrible fate during the Holocaust. But in the 1930s, she was part of this commander group of poets, most of them Jewish, who considered themselves modernists and held lively discussions, as well as publishing a satirical magazine named Szpilki, a word with untranslatable connotations, meaning pins or needles. Book publishing of books by Polish as well as Jewish authors was led by Jewish figures, and non-Jewish as well as newly acculturated Jewish readers flocked to bookstores in large numbers. In addition to these forms of cultural expression, Jews predominated in what might be called artistic technologies. The recording firm Sirena or Siren, under its Jewish ownership, recorded everything from the patriotic Polish anthem to jazz and popular hits. Just as crucially, Poland was one of the European centers of Jewish filmmaking in the interwar period, attracting world-renowned stars and making imaginative films, both in the silent and the sound era, with the result, as Nathan Gross, a scholar of Jewish cinema, put it, that there were no anti-Semitic films made in Poland before World War II. This was, of course, in marked contrast to German cinema of the period, but there is no doubt that in the 1930s, Poland, side by side with a vital Jewish culture, witnessed increasing strains of anti-Semitism. This was unhappily true at major universities where Jewish students, especially in the fields of law and medicine, constituted a disproportionate majority and where non-Jewish students demanded a so-called ghetto bench, which required Jewish students to sit separately from others. Many decided to remain standing instead, and there were professors in some of the universities who protested against this ugly form of prejudice. But nevertheless, quite a few Jewish students decided to leave the country and study elsewhere. The chief reason for such developments was the increasing power of the right-wing National Democratic Party and its encouragement of ethnic nationalism. But there were other factors as well. In a period of worldwide depression and in an endemically poor country, economic competition between Poles and Jews became more bitter. And while the Jewish population included deeply impoverished communities, it has to be admitted that in the upper echelons of wealth, it was Jewish and German entrepreneurs and industrialists who predominated. In the city of Łódź, which was the center of the textile industry, a kind of Manchester of Eastern Europe, industrialists who owned the great enterprises employed Polish and Jewish workers, and their treatment of those workers was far from humane. At times, this led to the rise of inter-ethnic solidarity as Polish and Jewish workers united in strikes and protests. But in the numerous shtetls which dotted the Polish countryside, and where Jewish people were traditionally shopkeepers and traders, there were boycotts of Jewish businesses sanctioned by the governing party, which sometimes led to explosions of thuggish violence. At the same time, the inhabitants of these small towns often continued to favor Jewish shops and market stalls to which they were accustomed, managed by Jewish neighbors whom they knew, and often offering better and less expensive merchandise. A very mixed picture then, but for all the unhappy symptoms of the time, it cannot be said that this was what led to or caused what happened soon after, the Shoah. That event was propelled by Nazi ideology and the invasion of Poland by the Soviet Union from the east and Germany from the west. The ending of the long history of Polish Jews was of the most tragic kind. But history is not like story, in which the unfolding narrative leads to a more predetermined end. Before the last chapter, there were centuries of life which deserve to be studied and remembered, not only for the sake of historical knowledge, but for their sheer illumination and interest, and also as a rich source for thinking about forms and problems of multicultural coexistence, even as we continue to struggle with such issues in democratic societies today.